We're looking at how the gifts that God gave irrevocably to Israel, and which Yeshua then redeemed, can enable us to become more alive to God and therefore better able to fulfill the calling that we have been given in our time, which is to witness to the nearness of his coming. And so important were these gifts in Paul's view that he used them to launch his Romans 9 to 11 passage saying about Israel, to them belong the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple service and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, the Messiah, who is over all, God blessed forever. So let's now think about the first gift, the gift of adoption, which often gets translated as sonship, which John also recognized of being of such importance that he launched his gospel with it, saying, whoever did receive him, speaking of Yeshua, to these he gave the right to become children of God. And later adding, see how glorious a love the Father has given us, that we should be called God's children. And so we are. The consequence of which, Paul said, was that we might be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. So evidently, both Paul and John understood how the first believers' grasp of being God's children had played a leading part in enabling them to turn the world upside down. And they were prompting their readers to look to see from the Hebraic perspective where all this began, which was in God telling Moses to say to Pharaoh, Adonai says, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So let my son go, that he may serve me. And this was not just a serious warning to Pharaoh, because if he refused, his own firstborn son would be killed, but it was also a mega revelation of how God saw Israel. Because this went further than any human being could understand, having declared that every firstborn, man or animal, should be consecrated to him. So, even though only being his firstborn through adoption, this made Israel irrevocably special to God as no other people were, and therefore were the ones to whom, and also through whom, he would give a unique revelation of himself. The consequence of which could be huge both for them and for the world, as pictured in Psalm 2 that says, you are my son, today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will give thee nations as your inheritance, and the far reaches of the earth as your possession. And doubtless the first believers knew how God had kept reminding Israel of what this was all about, by prompting them to maintain their own extensive genealogy, such that the word son then occurred in Torah toward 4,000 times. And also how, despite Israel falling so far short of how they should have then lived as God's firstborn, he still gave prophecies to them about how he'd redeem their adoption, such that instead of you are not my people being said to them, they will be called children of the living God. Indeed, that because of who they were to him as his firstborn, they would experience a final messianic blessing, such as through how Amos, who prophesied first about a great restoration of the Davidic kingdom, saying, in that day I will raise up David's fallen tabernacle. I will restore its breaches. raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in days of old, so they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations called by my name. And then secondly, about unimaginable blessing upon the land, saying, behold, days are soon coming when the plowman will overtake the reaper, and the one treading grapes, the one sowing seed. The mountains will drip sweet wine, and all the hills will melt over. And then thirdly, of immense blessing coming upon the nation of Israel, prophesying, yes, I will restore the captivity of my people Israel. They will rebuild desolated cities and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will also make gardens and eat their fruit. Yes, I will plant them on their land, and they will never again be plucked up out of their land that I have given to them. Adonai, your God, has said it. And through Yeshua's teaching about the kingdom of God doing as both Son of God and Son of Man, as well as being the Son of David, the first believers must have seen how this could happen through his end-time kingdom. More than this, how they could even know his coming as being near, no matter when it might actually be, which was through them experiencing very tangibly how he'd redeemed the gift of adoption for them, such that whatever their previous identity, they could now know themselves as no longer a slave but a son, and if a son, also an heir through God, indeed as heirs of God and joint heirs with Messiah, through which they could then live expectantly as they look to the end-time kingdom, rather like heirs of a future material inheritance, tend to live with much confidence, knowing what's going to become theirs. And so, as the first believers sought to do God's will on earth as it's done in heaven, they felt themselves to be near to the coming of his kingdom, which enabled them to then face whatever they had to, and through which God then shone his light. All of which points to the role of the gift of adoption in enabling the fullness of the Gentiles and the end-time preaching of the gospel of the kingdom throughout the world, whatever may then be going on in it, as well as to how it can enable us, even right now, to become more alive to God by seeking its original significance and then choosing to live in how Yeshua redeemed it. And it's just the same for the second irrevocable gift that God gave to Israel to equip them to be a light to the nations, which was the gift of glory, and which John also endorsed as being of immense significance, including it right at the start of his gospel again, saying, "And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. We looked upon his glory, the glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth." So by inference, John was saying that this also played a great part in enabling the first believers to be who they were and to do what they did, alluding to them experiencing through Yeshua something of what was pictured at the end of the book of Exodus, which was of how the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of Adonai filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter into the tent of meeting because the cloud resided there and the glory of Adonai filled the tabernacle. And on from this to the many other stories of how God had revealed his glory to Israel as to no other nation, most awesomely seeing it descend as a consuming fire onto Mount Sinai, out of which God spoke to Moses during 40 days and nights, causing the mountain to tremble and great fear to come upon them. Then most continuously through the cloud that went ahead by day and the pillar of fire by night during 40 years of wilderness journey. Most directly when it filled the temple after Solomon's prayer of dedication, and fire fell from heaven to consume the burnt offerings and sacrifices, so that the priest could not even enter the temple. And then, most shockingly, as it descended to bring judgment at the rebellion led by Korah, when the ground opened up and all his men along with their households and possessions were swallowed up. And most personally, through encounters like Moses had at the burning bush when God declared, "I am who I am." The purpose of all these revelations of God's glory being to reveal to Israel who he was and how he wanted to be known by them, which both John and Paul were saying had been so consequential for the first believers, as they'd seen it revealed through Yeshua, who the writer to the Hebrew believers described as having the radiance of God's glory and the imprint of his being. Also reminding the first believers of the vision of Daniel when he saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was brought into his presence. Dominion, glory, and sovereignty were given to him, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will never pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. So through their encounter with Yeshua, the first believers were put in touch with both the revelation of glory that God first gave to Israel, as well as with the overwhelming revelation of God's glory there will be in the end-time kingdom, and which then challenged them to step up to the prophetic calling of Isaiah to arise, shine, for your light has come. The glory of Adonai has risen on you. For behold, darkness covers the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But Adonai will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Because however far ahead the final coming of the kingdom was to be, they knew their calling was to live every day in the expectancy of it. As Paul put it, for God who said, "Let light shine out of the darkness," is the one who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Messiah. The possibility of which is as much for our generation as it was for the first generation of believers, and as it will be for the final generation. Because, as Paul put it, now to him who is able to do far beyond all that we ask or imagine, by means of his power that works in us, to him be the glory in the community of believers and in Messiah Yeshua throughout all generations, forever and ever. So by seeing the gifts of adoption and glory through the Hebraic perspective, then what can become so much clearer is the immense potential of this glorious mystery of the Gentiles, which is Messiah in you, the hope of glory. And the more we get to understand that, the more likely it is that things will happen both in us and even through us, which will go far beyond anything we might ever have thought or imagined. So with that, let's now think about these three questions. How does understanding Israel's adoption help us continually count ourselves alive to God? And also by understanding Israel's experience of God's glory. And then thirdly, how did Yeshua combine sonship and glory?